Good morning. Welcome to the final presentation of the Oceania semester. We do have 2 films next week, but other than that, this is it. We've saved the best for last. And this is a presentation I have been looking forward to learning more about this fabulous museum in Chanute, Kansas, the Martin and Osa Johnson Safari Museum. Who would have guessed that Chanute, Kansas, population 9,600, would have what has been called the best museum in Kansas, and a safari museum in Chanute. If you haven't been to Chanute, it's about an hour and 40 minutes from here. Not a bad drive. So you're going to hear all about these famous Kansan explorers, Martin and Osa Johnson. Osa was from Chanute. We're very pleased to have the curator of the museum here today, Jacquelyn Borgeson Zimmer. She was hired in 1995, just after graduating with an MA in Museum Studies from Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. Her job is to develop collection conservation programs and curate the museum's on-site and traveling exhibitions. She is also the liaison with the museum's 3 sister museums in Africa and Malaysia. She has presented lecture programs and done collection field studies across the U.S. at the museum's sister cities, as well as in Chile, Ireland, the Czech Republic, and most recently, Vanuatu. For the 100th anniversary of the Johnsons' expeditions to Oceania, she worked with the Vanuatu Heritage Center to develop and open a photograph exhibition. Before I invite Jacquelyn to the stage, let me give you the event code for today if you're taking the survey, so that you'll be entered into a drawing for a $1,000 study abroad grant. The event code is 6431, and you can pick up an Oceania brochure, and there is a link and a QR code. So this is your final chance to enter that drawing. You have to complete the survey. Again, code 6431. And I think you're going to get another code later on for a free pass to the Safari Museum. So without further ado, let's welcome Jacquelyn Borgeson Zimmer.
Thank you. We're having a little feedback occasionally here, but I'll try to stand away from it. Thank you for all coming out. I know it's cold early morning. I'm going to clip through just a little bit about who Martin and Osa were, and then talk about our collections, and then we'll go back to the museum kind of at the end. And I do have some film footage as we go through, but we'll just start clipping through now. If you don't know who Martin and Osa were, and a lot of people don't, they were 2 kids from Kansas, hence the 2 people with a Kodak that took these pictures. Osa was born in Chanute, Kansas. Martin's family made it to Kansas as they pioneered west when he was 9 months old, so he considers himself a Kansan, even though he was born elsewhere. But they lived in Independence. He grew up in Independence, Kansas, and she obviously lived most of her early life in Chanute. These are the places they went together. I'll skip ahead after this and talk about what Martin did before he met Osa with Jacquelyn. But this just gives you an overview in case you're studying other people or places of where they went. You can go to our website. You'll have contact information at the end. But this is just the 9 safaris or expeditions, whatever you want to call them, that they did together as a married couple. When he was just a boy, 18, he heard that Jack London, the writer, the American author, was doing a trip around the world, and it would start in the South Seas, and he really wanted to go along. So Martin, along with hundreds of other young men, wrote to be a crew member of this ship, and he was the one that was chosen out of hundreds and hundreds. Now Martin had continually run away from home in Kansas. He wanted to go see things. So he had a little experience with both a camera and traveling, so I think that put a leg up on him when Jack London picked him out of the crowd. But they went on this 45-foot sloop called the Snark, and this is the crew. It was Jack London, his wife, Charmian, her uncle, and then these were the 2 crews that had been picked out. Martin was picked as the cook because he lied and said he could cook in the letter. He could not, he had never touched a pan to our knowledge. There it is. He actually had to, when he got the job, his parents got him hired at a local restaurant for a month to learn how to make biscuits and basic things because he did not know how to cook. So between leaving in San Francisco and Hawaii, where they docked for the first time, he was fired as the cook, and the other boy who lied apparently and couldn't be a navigator was fired as navigation. They switched jobs. So he started out as a cook. But this is the itinerary that was supposed to be the Snarks itinerary, so it was rather ambitious. They did make it as far as the New Hebrides, but then they had to turn back because Jack London was ill. And Martin was the sole crew member left behind in the Pacifica as it was called then, to sell the ship and then send the profits back to Jack London. He had gotten ill, they thought he had leprosy, so he went home. Martin got hired by a French film group that wanted to film in the Solomon Islands, so he went with them, and then he returned to Europe with them, and then he came home, and he was the only member of the crew that went out and went all the way around the world. So he kind of out Jack London at the time when Jack London was the most famous person, so he got a lot of fame for that. This talks about how we kind of know our collections and how we follow our collections. The last 2 years, we have found 45,000 new newspaper online articles about Martin and Osa. That includes their diaries, that includes some locations that we can confirm. We're going to get, towards the end, I'll talk about the mission of the museum and the vision of the museum, but this is where we get our information that backs up what Martin and Osa wrote. A lot of times anthropologists didn't take these two Kansas kids very seriously, so they kind of discount them, but by going through the newspapers, we can clarify where they were, when they were, and it's solving a lot of issues with identifying some of the photos. Going through those newspapers, getting ready for the 100th anniversary that Professor Stebbins talked about, I found that Martin had said he kept some negatives. So we dug around, and we found some copies of old nitrate negatives. And it turns out to be the 1908 negatives from the Jack London trip. So they just went crazy in Vanuatu when we were there because Martin and Osa weren't the first necessarily to photograph in the New Hebrides then, Vanuatu today, but they were the earliest to actually go into some of the interiors and film. They definitely were the first to make films, which you're going to see some of those. But 1908, that predates just about anything else out there. And it's from that whole region. And so we have those. And I've checked with Huntington, I've checked with the other Jack London holdings, and they don't seem to have them. So I'm not sure what happened to the originals, but thankfully some curator before me said, oh, we probably should make a copy of these negatives before we hand them off. So luckily we have them, and they can be copied and printed just perfectly. They're very small. These negatives, you're going to find out how good a photographer both Martin and Osa were, because these are negatives that are small and these are prints that are small, 3 by 5 or less. And the detail that comes up is pretty amazing when you go through them. This is Martin and Osa. They got married in 1910. They decided to that was when Martin came home from his Jack London trip. They decided to go back and finish what Jack London had been working on. They wanted to kind of recreate some of those trips of the Snark. They worked vaudeville to do it. So they were working with W.C. Fields and Will Rogers and all the famous vaudevillians of the day. And they went around for 7 years saving up to go on their first trip back to where Martin had left off with Jack London. This gives you the map. I'm going to cover 3 of the Oceania countries today, and at least 2 of the dependencies that are called today. We have New Caledonia. They went to Cook Islands, Tahiti. You can see all these over here. They would come from San Francisco, go to Australia, and then they would have to take a steamer that might take 3, 4, 5 months to go around the island chains, and they would stop and change steamers and pick up and go and make the films. This is a little closer to show you. I'm going to definitely focus on the Solomons and not the Tahiti and the more prevalent photos. This is Samoa Harbor. Martin thought it was the loveliest harbor. He wanted to make sure Osa saw it. But this just shows you, the photograph is a 3x5, and we always thought, well, that's just a church, this little thing up here. But then we scanned it high resolution for the exhibit. It's a clock tower, and we can see the time they came into port. The only blurry thing in the entire photo, which was taken aboard a steamer, so a rocking boat, is the man's broom as he brushed the coal off. They were stopping for coal and wood. So that's the level of photography that Martin and Osa had in 1917. They were there on the cusp of when things were changing. This is a trader with his wife, but while they were there, they were still practicing the traditional dances. So Martin asked permission from her to film her in her full costume so it would be remembered. And she allowed it, even though she wore Western clothes most of the time. And the detail, when you blow it up, you can count the dolphin teeth on her costume. Those are dolphin's teeth. So there's just a lot of detail that you can get from these historic records. Martin had written later in life, when they went to Africa, that if he could have been with Lewis and Clark, he and Osa could have made a record for our Native Americans that doesn't exist. And so they wanted to do that other places, and these were just the places that they could do. This is the locations I'm going to go over the most with you. Again, I'll just hit the more frequently visited ones a little less. But just so you can see, there's the camera. I've been asked about some of the camera technology. If you have any questions about that, you can always ask at the end. But this is them filming on New Hebrides, but we'll flip through kind of the route they took in. This is Tahiti. They obviously, you see all the pretty girls in Tahiti. That's kind of a standard picture everybody took. Kind of, this is their tourist shot as they headed in. They went to then Rarotonga in the Cook Islands. Again, Rarotonga, but on the other side where most people don't go. And so we have some photos from those as well. New Caledonia, which is, of course, a French-owned part now, and that's why it's not one of the independent countries that's on your list. But they're still very oceanic. And these were men who were recruited, black-bearded, where they would come, corporations like the glue companies, Lever Brothers Soap would come to an island under either British or French control, and they would take the men and hire them and say, well, when 1 year they'll be released and they'll have made this much money, but then that year turned into 2 and 3, and sometimes they never came home. They always just worked on those plantations, almost like slave labor. And Martin actually did a film, which doesn't survive. We haven't found it yet anyway. I'll get into a little bit about their films later. But it was called The City of Broken Men, because he met the young men, but then he saw the ones that were finally brought home because they just couldn't work anymore, and they were just abandoned at the dock because they hadn't earned money for their communities. So they couldn't go home, and they just stayed there. So he did a film called The City of Broken Men, and they're actively seeking it in New Caledonia, and we've had a couple leads, but we haven't seen any footage from it. Solomon's, the Johnsons ended up having to stay there quite a bit because their steamer was delayed, the first of many steamers that were delayed. So they got some really good pictures in the Solomons. Dancing, you'll see some films of that coming up. Participating in different events, visiting the artificial islands that had been built. Again, that time period where you've got traders have been there now for 50 years. They've intermarried. They're starting to change the traditional customs. So Martin filmed both. He was interested in the change of it, and Osa too. And Osa, being a woman, actually had access that Martin didn't have. And so you're going to see later on some of the access she got that is just unheard of even today. Just interesting portraits. I know the Johnsons are remembered for their wildlife conservation. Everybody just thinks of them as African explorers, but the portraits they made of people around the world, I think, are their most important legacy. And as the curator, I've kind of driven the mission towards making it more a biographical of all the people, and we'll talk about that at the end. But these portraits, they've not been seen. If you go through anthropology books, they don't cite us as a source. They act like they don't exist, but it's a huge visual record that's just waiting to be examined. Everything, again, the more traditional clothing, the metal piece, the adornments that they use. This man's name is Tyler. We know his name. Occasionally, the Johnsons would reference the names in the books. A lot of times they're written on the back of the photographs, but the photographs, unfortunately, were glued in albums, and some of it can't be read, even when we take it off. This was also the crew. Look at the little boy. He's their cabin boy, so he started working very young. These are soldiers that worked for the British government. The Johnsons had to get permission from the British, and they had to get permission from the French, because at this time the British and French held jointly, if you can imagine how bad it is to be under one colonial lord. Try being under two at this time. So the Johnsons had to go through. So they went to see the British commander here, and these are his soldiers. And while there, they met this man, and he was about to be killed publicly. He was publicly hanged with 3 other men for not paying his taxes. And he asked Martin and Osa to take his picture for his family. So Commodore Bell was not a pleasant person. He was the one sent there to get taxes. He was doing his job. The Bell family has contacted our museum and asked for photos, and they put up a center there to try and reestablish some of the bad that their grandparent did during his stay. But the Johnsons really didn't like Commodore Bell. Later on, about 2 years later, Martin and Osa were being interviewed in Hollywood for one of their Hollywood films, and they heard, the reporter said, "Oh, by the way, Mrs. Johnson, have you heard that Commodore Bell was killed and eaten in an uprising in the Solomons?" And Osa turned and she said, "I wish I could say I was sorry. Next question." And just went right over it. He was the person that told Martin he couldn't take Osa with him, that it wasn't a place for a woman couldn't do these things. And Martin said, "Yeah, she's coming," because Osa said, "If you go, I go," and that's just how they were. So Bell was kind of an interesting person, and you can go through his own family and research him online and read some interesting stories about what colonial overlord happened in the Solomons. They did film the children doing their daily work. We got girls in the boats fishing, the boys out gigging. This is a very bad picture, and Martin Johnson didn't keep bad pictures. If he took them, he would destroy them once he developed them on site. They didn't wait till they got home to do their development. They had to do it there, because if they didn't get the picture they needed, they had to go back. It was a year to get there, so you couldn't just go back and forth. So he kept this picture for a reason, and then find out it's the Rennell people. And this is by far the earliest photograph of these. They're in the Solomons, but it's kind of an outlying island, and they were very remote. They didn't like outsiders. We think they were probably coming because they were thinking they could work for one of the factories, and they had probably come to an inner island. But it's on record as the only photo of the Rennell Islanders that predate anything, I think, earlier than 38, and this is 1917. So we have some unusual photographs that could play into research projects or be useful. This is a funeral. The woman's on the gravesite. You'll see a little bit of this in one of the films. It was unusual to have access to the funeral processions and the cemeteries. It's something that even then they didn't want outsiders to look at. A lot of the British had said, "Oh, you'll never get to film any of that." Martin and Osa filmed it all. They filmed some things that you're not going to be able to believe they were able to film. This is one of the films. We'll start it. I'm not sure how far. It's not that long. I think it's about 8 minutes. So this will be our first film clip. Aha, thank you. We'll leave that out. These are silent, unfortunately, because you can actually see people talking and responding to questions. We hope sometime to have a lip reader. We always go out and try and find lip readers to answer some of these questions. If any of you attended Dr. Lamont's Lindstrom's program last month, we've asked him, he's gone through and looked on the TANA footage trying to figure out what they're saying or what they're talking about. And while we were there, we did solve one of the scenes I'll point out when we get to it. There was an Australian anthropologist who was able to tell us exactly what was going on. And it confirmed what Martin had said, that had not been believed in the day. These islands are artificial. They were built specifically by the locals to live offshore when there was some fighting going on. And so the Johnsons have extensive footage and stills of these. They still make them even today in some of the areas. It's completely built up. Obvious, that's a colonial coconut grove that they're going into there. And these are all the coconuts from the coconut harvest, which they still do today. But not so much for the corporation. entered the Food Network portion of the film. I wanted to show this clip. It's the longest of all the clips because it shows that it wasn't just them being attacked by the people or people getting ready for a raid. The things that made it into the Hollywood films obviously were very different than what Martin and Osa made. And these were the shows that ended up in their 10-minute reels that they spoke personally along with and went to universities and other places. Martin fought with Hollywood quite a bit because he didn't like how they edited his films and the things that made it into the films and the things that didn't make it into the films. But this is just a wealth of information for people actually studying these different people. And we have hours and hours of it that I can tell you that no one's laid eyes on that hasn't worked at our museum. But it's there for anyone who wants to do research. It's wrapping up with this one. A lot of them were smoking. I think they traded for it. I don't know that they themselves had it. I think maybe from Australia. That would be my guess. They did a lot of trading. You'll see a lot of, I know you've been studying a lot about Australia, and you have that here. You'll see a lot of crossover. In fact, you'll see some that had gone to Australia and were recreating their performances on a Johnson film with the full body paint from Australia, even though they're Vanuatu, the locals of Vanuatu. See if we can forward on. Okay, so this is when they finally get to Vanuatu. This is where Martin had really wanted to go because Jack London had convinced him that there was cannibalism going on and he wanted to film. He wanted to see it. I mean, that's what, as a little boy, people grow up wanting to see, to document, to make, it's going to change. So he wanted to be there. So they landed on Vau, the island of Vau, which is part of Malekula, the island of Malekula, and they had to stay there for a while, so I have some really great pictures of Vau, because they were told not to go on the other side of the island because it was too dangerous. The other side of the island was rebelling against both the French and the British, and they didn't want missionaries to move in there, and they were told it was too dangerous to go. So Martin and Osa spent a lot of time on Vau trying to figure out how to get over there and what safe way to do it. So I think 38 days were spent on Vau. And they met some of the local South Bay Islanders came over, and the Tenmaro Islanders came over to visit the missions, and they started talking to them, and they felt more comfortable about going over there on their own without permission, and they got beautiful portraits like this of what were then the big Nambas. They're still the big Nambas today. It's for the penis wrap. That's what the name is. And these gentlemen all are from that group, but they were visiting Vau. There's a territorial line. My husband and I crossed it when we were there. Small numbers versus big Nambas, and you weren't supposed to cross, and it's still there. It's still marked when you go by. But they had crossed over because they heard there were some people who maybe wanted to come over and meet their chief. So Martin talked to him, and Osa talked, and they said, yeah, we want to come over, and nobody would take them because it was too dangerous. Again, the chief sent over some of his people and tried to figure out a way for them to come. They weren't allowed to just leave with them. And then he himself came over, and he talked to him at the mission and said, oh, no, you should come over to our house over at our village over. You get at Tamar Bay, you go up into the forest. And so they hired 3 whalers, so local whalers, who agreed to take them there, but tried to convince them not to go, but agreed to take them there. And they didn't trust the local whalers, because the whalers said, oh, we're too afraid to go up on the shore. Leave your stuff here. And Martin and Osa felt like, well, they were going to take their stuff and go. So they brought everything off onto the beach at Tenmaro Bay. And Nihapat, this gentleman, the chief, came down and he said, oh yeah, we want to take you up into the hills where at that time their village was located in the far interior and you had to hike up these huge mountains. Today it's on the beach. It's right on they have moved out of those mountains because they're just too inaccessible today to get what you need. So they now live right on this beach where the Johnsons were. And so they took everything off their ship, and the 3 whalers are like, you don't know what you're doing, this isn't good. We're just gonna go hang out over here offshore, and if you need us, let us know, but we're not coming with you. And so then there's the debate. Martin and Osa felt threatened. They felt that they had been captured and they weren't going to be allowed to leave by Nihapat and his men. And they claimed to flee for their lives and to escape, and that they ran down, they lost everything. They lost all the film they had left, everything that they had with them. No cameras, nothing. Martin had one 10-minute reel in his camera that he carried in Osa. That was it. They lost everything. These whalers supposedly came in, picked them up, saved them, and then took them back to Vow, where this was reported. The story that they reported there is the same story that later appears in newspapers around the world. We've got French versions. We've got it all over the world. I truly believe that they felt threatened, but it was their own fault for trespassing in the middle of a rebellion. And they knew they were wrong. They admitted they were wrong to go there later on. And all these articles kind of say the same thing. It's the same story. They really felt like they could not have left. Martin Johnson didn't leave cameras and films behind at any other point in their lives, not in the Solomons, not when it got damaged here and there. This is the only place we don't have any film from, except this little 10-minute clip where it seems tense, that they're uncomfortable together. So they used that 10-minute film, and they made a film that they sold to Hollywood, and it became what we would consider today a viral film. It went viral as you could in 1917. It ran in front of every World War I newsreel that appeared anywhere in the United States, in Europe. These two Kansas kids being captured by cannibals, this little footage appeared, and they became overnight sensations. They had spent 7 years working vaudeville to pay for the first trip. In 3 months, they made enough money to go back, and that's exactly what they did. They used this film. This is the Cannibals of the South Seas. It made them enough money in 3 months to go back, and I'm going to show you just a little bit of this film just so you can kind of see the Hollywood version. It's not all, them being chased and everything, but it was enough with the story that they had to fill theaters across the whole United States. And we'll see. I'm just going to click it, I think. And some editions had plates, title plates, and some don't. We couldn't get ours to play on a PowerPoint. This is a travel film archive, hence the name. And I won't be showing you all of it, because if I show you all of it, we have to pay for that usage. So we have this film in its entirety, both with placards and without, but it just wouldn't play today that you could actually see it. They didn't really have film from the incident other than that little bit. They used film from the Solomons, they used films from the other places as well in this, telling the story of going there. So it's very hard to go through the Hollywood film because it's so cut up into different pieces to figure out which people came from which island. And we hope that once we identify the still photos, we'll be able to do that. Yeah, this one has one placard. and it's for the Tolman lady. You're going to see her later on because we had a happy revelation about her on our trip. Okay. So they said we were wrong. We went there and we didn't explain what we were doing. We're going to fix that. So Osa learned Pidgin English. Today we would call it Bislama in Vanuatu, the language. Martin brought his film supplies, and they went with bodyguards and interpreters. They went straight back to Ten Morrow Bay. This is Ten Morrow Bay. They put all their stuff back on the beach again to show that they trusted them. And they said, we're going to show you a film and explain that we aren't here to take your island, because it became assumed that a husband and wife coming to an island was the lead for a government to send missionaries in and take an island. And so they wanted to explain that they weren't there for a plantation, they weren't there to set up anything. They wanted to make films, so they set up an entire film theater in here, and you're going to see some pictures from that as we go through, and then I'll show you a little bit of the reaction that happened that night. So right on the shore, they set up the movie lobby posters. They brought them with them they showed the individual lobby cards of the different people who were there. They had to wait. There was a rainstorm. It was monsoon season, so they had to cover it all up, and they actually posted guards to make sure water wasn't getting on the equipment because they were going to show it that night one way or the other. This is Nihapat with a generator. This is a peerless generator, and it's what operated the movie camera that night. Barely, it didn't work very well in the humidity, but this photo sold thousands of peerless generators around the United States. It was an ad that later ran in newspapers everywhere. This is the screen they set up right there on the sacred grounds. They were allowed to show it there because they told them it was going to be images from their last trip. And this is the film itself. It's just it shows a little bit of them showing it to the locals that night. Again, anthropologists used to take pictures and show, and film reactions of people to those photographs. Martin and Osa were doing that before anybody else, with no schooling, with no education. They wanted to see how the people reacted to the photos that they took. So Martin filmed the entire process.
Rolls of film are saved, and months later, Nihapat will be on silver screens from Hollywood to Broadway. A year passes. Martin is determined to return to show the big numbers the movie he filmed on their island.
Practically everyone shown in the picture was in the audience. As each man appeared on the screen, the audience shrieked his name and roared with laughter. Suddenly, the roar became a hushed murmur as the figure of a man who had been dead for a year was shown. The natives were awestruck. Martin's magic had brought a dead man back from his grave.
This again shows the photo of Nihapat. He was twice a Hollywood star because they again showed it later when they returned. I was a little worried about being in Vanuatu and showing this, and we actually had a grandson of Nihapat come to our show. And I was like, well, we'll see how this goes, but it is what it is, so I wanted to show it to him. And he was the only member of the audience that made a noise, and it was like, oh! And I thought, oh no, how's this gonna be? And he came up to me after, and through a translator, he said, I didn't know my grandfather was a Hollywood star. He thought it was fantastic. He had only seen one photograph of his grandparent before that. There's a real famous postcard of the Johnsons' photo. He had that, but on this exhibit that we did, the 100th anniversary, we had dozens of pictures of him there, and I showed a lot more of just Vanuatu. And so he actually got to see his grandfather. I was so excited to meet a grandchild. But then the next day we met 2 more. And then we met another 5 on a dock, and then we met another 12 here. He had 50 wives. And we asked a couple of them, do you think that the story that Martin and Osa told that maybe Nihapat wanted to keep Osa as his wife? And they're like, he had 50. If he wanted a woman, he took a woman. Every village he added, he took a woman. So it was more difficult not to find a grandchild of Nihapat on this island than it was to find them. But all of them kind of confirmed that, like, yeah, that kind of sounds like a reasonable story. And it is a story that the Johnsons stuck with all their lives later on, got the film, got the dates. But when they went back and explained themselves, they became best friends. Nihapat, I mean, there's hugging and crying when they leave, and he sends them off with his best men. So he opened an access door that no one else could. Here's Osa interviewing some of his wives. We didn't see any big numbers women when we were on the island. They're still kind of really kept in the background in the village that we were at. There was a funeral going on, so that also inhibited our access because there was a funeral going on and we respected it. We stayed out of the way. But a female anthropologist was there, and she said she had a difficult time getting in and interviewing the women. She couldn't believe some of the photos we had of Osa just chatting with them back in the day. She's like, you just don't see it. And you don't see photographs of them being allowed. You just didn't see that. You know, we were hoping to get her name. We're on the lead of getting her name, but everyone seemed to recognize her throughout the stay and the talks that we did. Just portraits. These are just continuing photos that they took after their stay with Nihapat and introducing why they were there to make films. They got to see this. This is a funeral, basically. They're saving the head of someone's grandparent or parent that had died, and they're making a clay mask to go in his romperam, which is a very sacred piece. They allowed Martin to film it. They allowed Osa Johnson to be on the men's ceremonial grounds. That's Monty, Dr. Lindstrom, could not believe that Osa took these photos, and I'm like, Osa must have taken these photos because Martin was making the motion picture of the exact scenes, and they're in sequence. So it wasn't anybody else there that could take the photo but Osa. So she made it into the sacred grounds at this point. The photos are just, again, amazing. It's a very small photograph, but you can see detail, again, some of the body paint, just little faces we had never noticed throughout the whole thing. There were just hundreds and hundreds had come out for the ceremony and allowed Martin and Osa to film it separately and together. Again, just you can see some of the mix. There's definitely an Australian vibe going on here. Some of these men had decided they didn't want to be recruited, but they were going to go to Australia and work for a year and bring some money home and some guns home because they planned to take on the British. And so all those guns you see that the men have are Schneiders from Australia, and they picked up the Aboriginal body paint, some of the dances. You'll see they're very Australian. The anthropologists in Vanuatu were like, what's going on with this? This is obviously they'd just gotten back from Australia, and they're doing those dances. This is a romperan. It's the embodiment. It's in the houses, the men's houses. And we have still inside interior shots of that. Again, we were asked one place not to show these, but we were told we could show them by the Vanuatu Museum elsewhere for education purposes. But on Malakula, they didn't want this one shown because it is inside a sacred house. This is another short little film. I was going to just kind of a wrap up again. Just the access they got, just some of the dances are pretty interesting here. Martin and Osa physically could not have children, and they were denied adoption because of their lifestyle. And then after Martin's death, Osa could not, as a single woman, adopt a child. So everywhere they went, there were children because they really wanted children. So we have luckily when I go out, I'm the one that goes to Borneo or wherever. I've met children that are in the movies, in the photos, and done oral histories with them about how it was like. And so oftentimes you'll see Osa with children. This is sand tattooing. You see the big gun and those marks. That's actually a language. It's on the World Heritage List of languages. And locally they call it sand tattooing, and it has an official name. But we have close-up still photographs of it that could be deciphered. Again, nobody looks at the Johnson photos in the field, in the scientific field, until recently. We've had some people approach us recently because of the 100th anniversaries going on to use some of these. But again, you can see some of the arm paint, headdresses that weren't necessarily. This is more Solomon Islands going on here, so there's another mix on this one. There's the body paint. All the Vanuatu anthropologists were like, what? Why? And so we gave them all the photos, and they're off charting. They think they can figure out who went to Australia based on some of these. This is the scene that the anthropologists in Vanuatu confirmed for us. Martin had always said that he had filmed this scene and later found out that they had buried someone alive and that they were stomping the ground over that person in this funeral, even though the person had been alive, because they practiced euthanasia. And a lot of people didn't believe Martin and Osa when they said that, and they said, well, if we'd known, we would have stopped it, but we didn't know till after. But that was just a practice, and it was going on here. And sure enough, we were staying at the hotel of one of the anthropologist's wives, and we were walking out in the parking lot, and he's like, you know what they were doing in that film? And I said, well, we think we knew, but nobody believes it. And he said they were burying someone alive, and they were down on there putting the earth on the person. So it kind of confirmed what Martin and Osa had said back in the day too. So that's how we try and figure out our films. We actually go to the places and ask the local people or ask, specialists in the area. So again, we may not use that bit of footage as much because it's obviously a sensitive subject. This is when they're starting to, a little bit of the footage going up into Nihapat's kingdom the second time, just so you could kind of see the terrain. It's quite difficult to get to these places. Go on so you can see it. When they returned, they made a second Headhunters of the South Seas film. Then they went on to Borneo. That back then it was British North Borneo. Today it's Sabah, Malaysia. Throughout their films, when compilations would come up, you would see the South Seas put back in there because it was the turning point of their career. It was the moment when they had almost lost everything and they figured out how to do it. You learn the language, or Osa learned the language. We're not quite sure if Martin knew English sometimes, because he's so quiet, you just don't see him. He really just let the film run. But Osa would learn the different languages and introduce herself to the people and get the porters and do all the logistics of it, and live with the people in the tents, in the field, and show what they were there doing. A lot of times they give, like that man's family that was going to be killed, they give his family the photos. They did that everywhere on every trip after the South Seas because they learned that they needed to show why they were there. It might not work in translation. But in all their Hollywood films, this is after Martin's death, Osa did one. You can see the colorized version of the kind of mortician, the head dryer there. We have cartoons and serials of them all over the world. Places they never went. Chile, one of the reasons I got to go to South America, though they were never there. Their films were huge there. Comic strips were there. The real-life comics is 1947, so it's 10 years after Martin's death, and they were still in the day-to-day press. I mean, they were just quite famous in their day. The South Seas map, this is the one we use for visitors at the museum because it simplifies it for a fourth grade level, because it does get complex, but it shows you the route. This one is the Jack London route, really, with some asides to the Johnsons. But this really went on past Martin's death, and it went on past Osa's death. They were still in the news, especially in World War II, when men were being sent in the war. The soldiers were being sent to the South Pacific. Osa went and she did a whole book called Bride in the Solomons, and she did a whole book tour where she did nothing but go and talk to mothers and daughters and sisters and wives and explain where their men were and what it was like, and that they shouldn't really worry, because she really felt that the South Seas was going to be an easy win because they had so many holds already there. So it just really continued along past their deaths. The museum opened. Osa was trying to open a museum in 1953 when she passed away of a heart attack in New York for just the film records. They did not bring things home. They didn't bring artifacts home. They didn't bring people home, which back in the day sometimes they used to bring home people. Sometimes they would bring employees to care for the animals that they brought, and then they would send them home. But they really just thought their films should do it, should be the record that is left, just a visual record, again, something we don't have for our Native Americans. And so she was opening the Martin Johnson Film Institute in New York when she passed away. She was trying to fundraise money for it. So not having children, Martin had died in a plane crash, a commercial plane crash, in 1937. So she lived another 16 years, and she was trying to open this museum at the end of her life, and she died of a heart attack. Her mother inherited everything, all the photos, the films, everything that they did have. Some personal artifacts that had been given to them as presents they did keep. And she ended up opening the museum in 1961, and she named it the Martin and Osa Johnson Safari Museum. In that order, we take so much flack on Facebook that Martin's name comes first. She did it so that when you were looking on library cards, Osa Johnson stayed together and people could find us easier than Martin Johnson, which was a common name. So she was like ahead of her time for the internet. So that is how Osa always went by Mrs. Martin Johnson. She wanted it to be the Martin Johnson Film Institute, so we have that name because of Osa's mother. And we opened up, obviously, to share their legacy. Her mother asked for things to be donated to the museum from people who traveled with Martin and Osa, who may have collected things. Some of the museums that Martin and Osa worked for, she asked for things to be given back. So to this day, I get things in the mail that say, promise to Belle Leedy in 1972, promise to Belle Leedy in 1961. She lived to be 99 and 7 months old and worked at the museum till the day she passed. So I still get things as a curator. I've been there 25 years now, 24 years now, and I still get things. So that's how we got the pieces that we have at the museum. We have the largest collection of West African art in the country because she asked somebody to donate pieces to the museum. We have things from the Queen of England, the former Queen of England, Queen Mum England, because they traveled with Martin and Osa. So that's how we have things. The Johnsons did not take things from the people. I was asked if we had their cameras. Everyone's always interested in their cameras. Martin and Osa left their cameras behind when they left because they had trained the local men to know where film is, how to use the cameras. They wanted, in Africa, specifically in Africa, but also in Southeast Asia and Borneo where the elephants were already endangered, they wanted to leave behind an option of having camera safaris instead of hunting safaris. So we don't have their cameras unless they've come back to us later on. We have 3 or 4 of them, but so you have to look at the photos for their cameras. But we changed our vision about 10 years ago, and I've kind of been trying to drive that home, because I think we are a biographical museum, but we need to be a biographical museum of every single photo person in every single photo that we have, every single film we have. It's not just Martin and Osa or their story. We want to tell every story. So in 2004, I set up the first partnership in Malaysia. We have a sister museum there. I took all the photos. We had a 13-year-old volunteer scanned all 2,400 photos. Took them there, and they built an entire second museum from the ground up using the photographs, a heritage museum. And so now we have 2 sister museums in Southeast Asia. And I've met the people in the photographs. I've met their sons, their daughters, their grandchildren, and we've taken oral histories with them. Now that was back, obviously, some of them were from 35, the little boy there, Masri, who's one of my favorite people, right here. But we did find 1920, so we had hoped when we went to the 100th anniversary for 1917-19, we might get some names, and we did. I told you I met grandsons here, grandsons there. My husband and I were stranded on a dock for various reasons. The plane took off 4 hours early without us. Then we waited for, I don't know how many hours on the dock waiting for a ferry that never came. So we were stranded on Malakula for a day and a half. But at the dock, some people rolled up to say, oh yeah, the ferry's not coming. And come to find out, it's somebody who is, his grandfather's in the picture. And he knew him. And he recognized him from just the photographs. And he gave us his name. So now we have it. He also gave us this man's name, Aldani, who was in an earlier photograph. This man was both in the film, towards the very end of the film, and in one of the photos, Tupate. And then he gave us this location. And locations sometimes are key to figuring out the peoples when we have nothing else. But he was able to say, oh yeah, that rock, that's, Siramandu Bay. So it's really helping us with the photos. I left all my photos because the funeral was going on. We couldn't do our interviews. I left 48 of the photos. I brought huge photos with the anthropologist stationed there, and she took them around after the funeral and got some more names. I haven't gotten those yet. And then she also took them to the arts festival where 10,000 people came to that. And so she got some names there. So we are working towards naming every single person in the photographs, and I'm sure the curators after me are going to be thrilled with that task, but I think it's a really vital one for the museum because they are a visual history and record of the people in them. We knew Nihapat, obviously, but we got confirmation on the 2 men in the photo, and then here's the surprise. When people come to the museum, they see her picture and they're like, who is she? And we never knew. The baby, his son is still alive, and he's the last member of the village that still has the wrapped head. And so we were able to return photos. So if you want to come to the museum, and I hope you do, I wanted to bring some artifacts. Professor Stebbins, we had said we would bring some artifacts for you to see. We're getting ready to do a huge renovation at the museum where we'll have a full South Seas gallery. You can follow the process on our Facebook page. But it's just, in this weather, you can't have the pieces out, not when it's shifting like this. And they were easy enough to get to because of the storage, but just bringing them out just wasn't an option today. But Chanute is easy to find. We are the center of Google Earth. So it's another reason to come to boast that Chanute, Kansas is the center of Google Earth. The 2 boys that invented what became Google Maps were both from Kansas. Kansas has a lot of interesting people, but one of them is actually from Chanute. So when you download on a Macintosh, it goes straight to Chanute, Kansas, and you can see our museum in the background of it. So we are technically the center of Google Earth, and this is in the middle of the street in Chanute. The museum is in an old Santa Fe warehouse, or freight. We were in a freight office, and now we're in the depot, and we share it with the public library. So that's what our museum looks like. This is our website. You can go on and you can see their photographs. We have 15,000 online right now. Down here shows where the photos. Films we're adding every time we can there. But this just tells you what's going on. The current exhibit obviously is the 100th anniversary. It's coming down in 2 weeks. But in January, we'll install the full gallery. So, choose your time wisely. If you want to complain to my boss, there is his name. If you want to talk to me after, you don't want to take a question in public today, you can find my information there. And then, because I couldn't bring artifacts, take a picture of it if you want to get a hold of me or my boss. This is a free pass to the museum. Take a picture with your camera. If you want to be old school, you can come up here and get one of our flyers and write Ni Vanuatu is your super secret code. And this is good for people watching the film. I know they're going to post it other places. We're nonprofit. We have to charge admission because that helps us keep open. But I'm the curator and I constantly rebel against that, so we do everything we can to get people in free. And so if you say Ni Vanuatu when you come to the museum, you can come in free. There's no expiration date. There's no, one person only. If you come with a group, you come with a group and everybody gets in. So we'll just have you sign in at the front desk. But we always do that, so make sure to take a picture of it. If you're ever passing through Chanute, if you go up to Kansas City, you can veer over. You go over to Wichita, you can veer over and see us. We are 2 hours from everything. It's the joke that Chanute is 2 hours from everything. It's a little less from Joplin, but back in train days, it was still that long. So that's the end of my talk.